I'm still very new to watercolour, so I'm learning how to use it as I go along, but I thought I'd share my process with you anyway in case you learn something from it as well. I'm Kirsty Rebecca and I make drawing and painting tutorials that are easy to follow even if you're just starting out. This piece is a watercolour painting of a cow in a loose, expressive style, and I used the Fabriano cold pressed watercolour paper in A5 size, the Schmincke watercolours, and I also added some Caran d'Ache Luminance coloured pencil on top towards the end for some details. I have transferred my outline using transfer paper, but you can use a graphite pencil if you like. I then use a putty eraser to lighten up the line work as much as I can, but obviously so that you can still see the lines. And this is so that the line work doesn't show through in the end piece. And also the watercolor doesn't stick very well on top of a lot of graphite. So when there's excess graphite on the surface, it can get a bit muddy. So I always go through with that putty eraser and lift up some of the graphite. I've started by wetting the background first, and make sure that you don't wet the cow or the main subject that you don't want your background colour to be on. Watercolour will bleed anywhere the paper is wet, and it will stop where the water stops. So make sure that when you wet your paper, go over it a few times with your damp brush so that it's all evenly wet and the water isn't pooling anywhere. You don't want it to look really wet, just so that the surface is glistening a bit. Otherwise, when you put your watercolour on, it tends to puddle up in the areas that you have more water in. I've splattered on a light blue colour for the background to start with, and then I'm going to go through and blend some of it out so that it's a bit lighter and more transparent, but I'm still letting some of those initial drips show through. Watercolour works best when you're working from light to dark, so I always work my way up in layers, and this will also give it more depth as well than if you went straight in with the darkest colour straight away. The light will actually come through all of the layers and make it look a little bit more interesting in person to look at. And I'm going through and adding some more splatters of blue and gold by tapping my brush on the back of my hand gently and letting the paint splatter randomly from the brush. If you use different size brushes, then you'll get different size splatters and effects. If you don't want any splatters on your main subject, you could use a masking fluid, or you can put a piece of paper over the general areas to block out that section. When you splatter paint, if your paper is still wet, it will create a different effect than if it was dry. When it's wet, it bleeds and blends into the colours around it, and it creates more of a soft look. Whereas if the paper was dry, the drops stay where you put them and they have more of a harsh edge. So I like to use the wet on dry splattering towards the end of the piece and have the softer splatters at the beginning. It's just all personal preference, but whatever you like the look of, you can do that. Watercolour isn't a very forgiving medium, and it's really hard to fix mistakes, which is part of the reason why I love the expressive style. I can create more realistic and detailed pieces with other mediums, so I love that you can use this as an expressive style, and I like how it looks. If you work in this style, you can let the watercolour do what it wants to do and then work with it, because it can be very hard to control. So I've let the background dry and I've wet the base of the cow, so now I'm blocking in the base layer, and I really love using this gold watercolour because it gives you a nice random shine in some areas, and it has a bit more interest when you look at it in real life. So I'm adding in some different shades of brown in the darker areas, so there's a bit of a mixture of different browns to stop the piece looking flat, and it makes it look a little more interesting with the different colours. So I'm doing a few more splatters, and I like to add splatters in different layers so that they overlap because it gives it an interesting effect. Also, in some layers the paper was wet when I added the splatters, so it blended out quite a lot. So I like to have that contrast of having some splatters on dry paper because the edges are a bit stronger in those splatters. I also like to create the illusion of drips coming from certain areas. Like in this one, I've chosen to make a drip effect coming from the ear just for something interesting. Ideally, you would tip the paper upwards so that the drip falls down organically, but because I'm filming this, it's easier to see what I'm doing while it's laying flat. So I've let the entire piece dry again, and now I'm starting on the details like the nose and the eyes, and the reason I waited for the cow to dry first is so that the watercolour that I'm putting down now won't bleed into the other areas because it's quite a dark colour. When I have an area that is white or black on an animal, it doesn't matter which medium I'm using, I always make sure to add other colours with it. For example, there is a white patch going down the face on this cow, and I'm making sure that I'm adding some subtle blues in the shadows and yellows in the lighter areas to stop it looking flat and to make it look more realistic and 3D, like it's popping from the page. In real life, black or white fur actually reflects the colours that are around it, so a lot of the time, especially when the animal is outside, the whites will reflect the blue from the sky or the yellow from the sun or green if they're sitting close to the grass, so just keep an eye out for those different colours. And I'm now going back through and adding more depth to the shadow areas of the cow, and watercolour is very much a layering process. I keep darkening up the shadows and refining some of the details as I continue to add more layers. A good tip that I found when I first started with watercolour is to get 2 jars of water and an eyedropper. This may sound obvious to people who've been working with watercolour for a long time, but it really helped me out when I first started. So the first jar is to wash your dirty paintbrush in, and then you can rinse it in your clean jar after that. In this way, most of the paint stays in one jar, and then the other stays relatively clean, and you don't have to empty your water jars as often. And when you mix paint on your palette, and you realize that you need more water, instead of having to clean your brush in the dirty jar, which wastes the paint you have on your brush, to get more water from the clean jar, you can use the eyedropper and then get some clean water from your jar and then mix it in your palette without having to rinse and clean your brush every time to get more water from the jar. Hopefully that tip helps you guys out because it saved me a lot of time and wasted paint, and it helps to stop muddying up your artwork with brushes that have been rinsed in dirty water. When I'm working in this expressive style, I try and add more colours than what I see in the reference photo. For instance, I'm adding some really subtle, darker purples and magentas in the shadow areas to give it a bit more interest and to make it look a little bit more fun. If you find that you've added too much water or you didn't like where you put some paint or a splatter, you can lift up some water or paint while it's still wet with a tissue. Now I forgot to film this bit, but you can see on the left ear, it looks like there's kind of like lighter coloured stars, and that's because I sprinkled a little bit of salt there when the paint was still wet. I think it creates a really interesting texture, and I use this effect quite often as well. So before I started adding those darker colours in the shadow areas and that yellow tone where the sun hits, I actually let the cow dry again, just so that it didn't bleed too much into the areas that were already wet. So I've waited for the entire painting to dry again, and I'm going in with a white gouache to add some of the fur details on top. Gouache mixes really well with watercolour, and you can actually mix the white gouache with any watercolour paint to create a more opaque version of that colour. And I know some people think that you shouldn't use white watercolour, let alone opaque gouache, because you should let the white of the paper be the lighter areas, but I don't think there should be any rules to art. If you want to use white, it's not illegal. What matters to me is that I've enjoyed the process, that everything that I'm doing is archival and light fast in case I sell my work, and that I enjoy the way the final result looks. So I use the white gouache quite often because I really like that effect and it makes it a lot easier for me. I also really like using it watered down slightly to create the splatters on top. Watercolour is a great medium to mix with other mediums. Sometimes I use archival pens for the details, some people combine it with pastels, but in this case I'm actually using coloured pencils for the details. And I'm making sure that I'm using light fast materials as always. So these are artist grade Caran d'Ache Luminance coloured pencils for the details. And I'm just using them to smooth out any of the areas where I didn't like the effect of the watercolour, or to give it some more fur detail and definition to the eyes and ears and nose, and to brighten up any areas that I think need it. When you work with mixed media, just make sure that you put your water-based mediums before any wax or oil-based mediums. If you try and put watercolour on top of coloured pencils, which are an oil or wax-based medium, it won't be archival anymore, and the watercolour could potentially flake off because it doesn't stick well to the wax or the oil mediums. So if you're going to work this way, make sure that you only add your coloured pencils or your pastels once you're completely done with your watercolour. I always tape my pieces down when I'm working with anything that's on paper, but this is especially important for watercolour. You can tape your work to your desk if you want to, but for some reason my tape just won't stick to my desk, so I'm using a foam board that I cut down to a smaller size. I always use acid-free masking tape, not just any masking tape, and I try to make sure that it's low tack so it doesn't rip my paper when I remove it. And the reason you want to tape your paper down is so that when you wet your paper, it dries flat again rather than drying with ripples in it or warping at the edges. If your paper still isn't completely flat, Once your piece has been completed, you have a couple of options to fix it, and I've only tried this one on the Fabriano and Arches papers, which are both 100% cotton. I haven't tried it on the cheaper papers that aren't cotton, so you may want to do a test run if you're not sure. But the first option is to lay your painting face down on a clean surface, and then wet the back of your paper so it's damp, not too wet, and then lay another piece of paper on top of that to protect it. And then layer some heavy flat items like books on top of it overnight. In the morning it should be much flatter. Another way, which I haven't tried yet but I know it's very popular, is to iron the back of it with a iron that's on a low setting with a towel or another piece of fabric in between. I can't imagine why this wouldn't work as you're ironing something that is 100% cotton, so I'll try this in the future as well because it seems a lot easier and quicker than the first method. As I said previously, I'm still really new to watercolour, so I'm no expert, but I thought I'd share my process and take you along with me while I'm learning. So I hope this helped you in some way. I've created a playlist on the screen with some other watercolour tutorials that I thought you might like, so click on that and I'll see you over there.